Today, class, we're going to begin a new unit. Now, we've been studying propositions for some time, and as I said, there are three basic reasons we've been studying propositions, I should say. One is to be able to state equivalency between propositions that are worded differently. Either they're grammatically different or have different wording in them. Another is to state logical dependence between propositions. That is, if one is true, is the other one true, or if one is false, is another one false. But finally, we've also been studying propositions because we want to be able to determine whether or not an argument is valid or invalid. Now, we studied validity a little bit earlier, but it's been some time since we talked about it, and I want to remind you all of the definition of valid and the definition of invalid. Now, as I explained a long time ago, when we discuss whether or not a deductive argument is valid, and keep in mind, only deductive arguments can be described as valid or invalid. Or I should say, it's only fair to criticize or to critique an argument, a deductive argument, for being invalid, and to evaluate it as being valid. We really don't apply this distinction to inductive arguments. Now, when we talk about validity, this refers to the logical structure of the argument. And as I said a long time ago, a deductive argument is valid just in case if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Whereas a deductive argument is invalid if it is possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So if you have a deductive argument and you can conceive of a way, any way possible, for the premises to be true, and also imagine in the same scenario for the premises to be true and the conclusion be false, then you can prove that it's invalid. And to remind you of some examples I used a long time ago, here's an example of a valid argument. If I get an A, I'll pass the course. I'm getting an A, therefore I'll pass the course. If 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Now, here's an example of an invalid argument. If I get an A, then I'll pass this course. I'm passing the course, therefore I'm getting an A. It's possible for 1 and 2 to be true, but 3 to be false. After all, you could get a B, in which case the first premise, well, that's true independently of what you get. That's just a hypothetical. But the second one would be true because you're passing the course. You're earning a B, and yet the conclusion would fail to be true. Now, when we studied validity, we basically just used this method of counterexamples where we conceive of scenarios in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false in order to test validity. And that works fairly well for a lot of arguments. But there are also some arguments where it doesn't work so well. And I could give you some examples, but I'm going to save some examples for next class. But we're going to talk about how we can prove validity for a lot of the arguments where our intuitions they don't serve us too well, and we need more precise rules in order to figure out, or more precise method, I should say, in order to figure out whether or not a deductive argument is valid or invalid. Now, as I said a long time ago, there are all kinds of deductive arguments. I think I gave you guys just 3, but there are many, many different kinds. We're going to focus on one particular sort of deductive argument, which is called a syllogism. Why it's called this, I have no idea. But it's the most basic form of deductive argument, and it's any kind of deductive argument that has 2 premises and a conclusion. You've seen that this has been the most common kind we've been looking at. But you can have a deductive argument, presumably, that had, I don't know, as many premises as you could imagine. And could have even multiple conclusions. But a syllogism is just a deductive argument with 2 premises and a conclusion. And just as deductive arguments come in a lot of different kinds, so too do syllogisms come in different forms. And we're going to focus on one particular form as we move forward of a syllogism, which is called a categorical syllogism. And I know I'm throwing a lot of terminology at you right now, but I think it's pretty straightforward. But a categorical syllogism is just a syllogism that uses 2 categorical propositions in it. So here's an example. No animal with gills are mammals. All fish are animals with gills. Therefore, no fish are mammals. Notice that here I have 2 categorical propositions. Actually, I have 3, but we'll just not worry about that. But I have at least 2 categorical propositions in it. One right here, I have the quantifier no, I have the quantifier all, and then I have another proposition down here with the quantifier no. And so these are going to be the kind of syllogisms that we're going to talk about for the next couple of weeks. Basically, we're going to be talking about, if you want to, explain it in more layman's terms, how to reason properly when we're talking about classes of things, when we're reasoning about classes of things. After all, this is what categorical propositions are. They're propositions about classes. So how do we know when we've made an accurate and valid inference involving relationships between classes of things? So far, we've studied truth conditions that apply between categorical propositions. We've also discussed how we determine equivalency between categorical propositions, but now we're going to move on to talking about, well, how do we actually reason? We move from A and B to C with categorical propositions. So far, just it's another way of thinking about it. We've basically looked at two propositions, A and B, and it's like, okay, well, if A is true, is B true? Or is A equivalent to B? But now we're basically involving a third proposition, a third categorical proposition. We're saying, well, if A and B are true, does C have to be true also? After all, that's all validity is. It's like, if these two propositions are true, does the third one have to be? Now, when we talked about the square of opposition, we were doing the same thing basically there. It's just we were talking about two propositions. And it's like, well, if the first one's true, must the second one. But now, when we're talking about validity, we're basically, and specifically validity with categorical syllogisms, we're saying, well, if A and B are true, does C also have to be true? So I don't know if that makes it make more sense or not, but if you didn't get that muddled explanation, you'll be okay, I'm sure. So I want to discuss the parts of a categorical syllogism. It's going to be important in order to talk about validity. Before we get to that, to actually talking about validity, which will come in the next lecture, we have to just discuss the various parts of the categorical syllogism. Because there are going to be rules that we apply, and the rules aren't going to make a lot of sense if I'm saying, oh, it's an illicit minor term, and you have no idea what a minor term is. So we have to discuss the parts of the categorical syllogism. And we're going to begin by labeling this term right here, the predicate term in the conclusion. And we call the predicate term in the conclusion, whatever that happens to be, we call that the major term. Why? I don't know. Don't. I've had students be like, "Well, it's the major because it's the most." No, don't put too much thought in it. Just call it the major term. I don't know. We could have called it the schmajor term. We could have called it the melanger term. I'm just making up stuff. The twas brittle term. I don't know. Don't put too much. Don't try to give some like psychological or like historical explanation as to why it's called the major term. Just call it the major term. It's just the proper name. It's just like, why am I called Jesse? I don't know. My mom thought it sounded pretty. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. So it's just the major term is just the term that appears in the predicate of the conclusion. This term right here, the subject of the conclusion, we call, guess what? The minor term. Why it's called that? No idea. Don't know. Don't care. Doesn't matter. Now, if you notice, you look at this right here, you'll notice that the word mammals appears right here. The word mammals also appears here. The word fish appears right here. The word fish appears right here. But notice we have a term that doesn't appear in the conclusion. Right here, animals with gills. We also have animals with gills right here. And we call this the middle term. This is the term that occurs in both premises and links the minor. I just noticed I have a typo here. Sorry about that. It links the minor, this should say, and major term. When we were studying implicit premises, you might recall somebody would make an argument. We'd take an argument and say no animals with gills are mammals, and then the conclusion would be therefore no fish are mammals. And what we were basically looking for then, and I didn't want to use this language, is we were looking for a middle term, something to link the term that appears in the conclusion with the term that appears in the first premise with the term that appears in the conclusion. We were looking for a way to join, for instance, fish to mammals, and we needed some connection between them. And that's, in a word, what we were doing. We were coming up with implicit premises. We were figuring out a way to link the subject with the predicate. And that's what the middle term does. It links the subject and the predicate. Sorry about this typo. It's really bugging me. That should say major term right there. but the middle term links the minor and the major term. All right, so we have that. We're going to get rid of that because I need to clear space to talk about two more parts here. So we call this down here, number 3, we call it a conclusion. And we notice, I mentioned this earlier, the word mammals appears right here. And mammals also appears up here in the first premise. And this right here, this term in the predicate, we call the major term. Well, what do you think we call the entire premise in which the major term appears? You guessed it, we call that the major premise. So premise 1 is the major premise. It is the premise in which, basically just the premise in which the major term appears. If you ever want to know, well, which is the major premise and which is the minor premise, you just figure out, the first thing you do, figure out, well, what's the major term? And you figure out the major term, what's the predicate term of the conclusion, and then wherever you see that term appear, that would be the major premise. Well, this is the minor term, and you see fish occur in premise 2, so this would be the minor premise. Now, technically speaking, or logically speaking, I shouldn't say technically, but logically speaking, it wouldn't matter if the major premise came first or the major premise came second. If I took this first premise and premise 1 and 2 and I just flipped them, it wouldn't change the logic of the argument at all. It wouldn't change the logic of the argument at all. However, it is, for whatever reason, and I don't know why, don't care why really, it is convention to list the major premise first. And here is one place where maybe my students delving into the history of terms or the etymology of terms might matter. You might remember the major comes first, right? And the minor comes second. I don't know, it's the major, the most important comes first, but it's really not any more important than the other one, but I don't know, maybe that's a helpful mnemonic device for you. But it is a convention to put the major term first. And so putting a categorical syllogism into standard form, you always list the major premise first. Now, you've heard standard form, that term used before, because we have our propositions have a standard form. Remember, we talked about a proposition. You have quantifier, subject, copula, predicate. And the subject and the predicate must name classes. Well, that's standard form for the propositions, the individual propositions. And each one of these propositions should be in standard form. You should, in each one, have the quantifier, subject, copula, predicate. And the subject and the predicate should name classes. Well, just as the individual propositions all have to be in standard form, so too does the entire argument have to be in standard form. So there are two standard forms we're dealing with here. The propositions themselves and then the argument. And basically the argument in standard form is just to have the major premise first, the minor premise second, and the conclusion third. So I know it's a lot of terminology. It's not particularly sexy or fun, but it's just something that's important so that we can actually discuss validity, which is what I think is important and fun to talk about. All right, or interesting and fun. All right, so when we study categorical syllogisms, we're going to describe features of those, and all syllogisms have both a mood and a figure. And the mood of a categorical syllogism is basically just the order of the categorical propositions according to the quantifiers. I just said that in a really roundabout way. But the mood is basically, if you look at the order of the quantifiers and you just state the abbreviation for the, or state the abbreviation for the form of each of those, then you would state the mood. So I didn't say that in a very clear way, so let me go back. So look at this one right here. We have the quantifier no, all, and no. Now, the mood of this is going to be a no proposition is an E, all is A, and no is E. So the mood of this is going to be E, A, E. That's going to be the mood of it. And so basically you're just stating the order in which the quantifiers occur. Now, categorical syllogisms also have a figure, and the figure is determined by the position of the middle term. So the middle term, go back to this one, the middle term, actually I want to go back, there we go, sorry, the middle term. See, the middle term in the first proposition right here, it occurs in the subject term, but the middle term in theory could have occurred in the predicate, and the middle term right here could have occurred in the subject. And you see here that there are going to be four basic combinations in which the middle term could occur. The middle term could occur in the subject of, it could occur in the subject of the major premise, and it could occur in the subject of the minor premise. The middle term could occur in the subject of the major premise and the predicate of the minor premise. The middle term could occur in the predicate right here in the major premise, and it could occur in the subject. And the middle term could occur right here, and then it could occur in the predicate of the minor premise. So there are four possible combinations we have, and I have a chart here which lists them all. And there are basically four figures. And we'll say, well, this argument's in figure 1. And figure 1 would be if the middle term occurs in the subject of the major premise, and then it occurs in the predicate of the minor premise. Figure 2 would be in the predicate of both premises. Figure 3 would be in the predicate of, in the subject of the major premise and the subject of the minor premise. And the fourth figure would be in the subject of the minor premise and the predicate of the major. And the way I kind of think about this is it's kind of like a W. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know. It's kind of a bad W, but that's the way I always remember. I mean, the first figure is the easiest for me to remember because I was just like, all right, the first figure, you kind of start in the subject term, if the middle term's in the subject term, and you go down diagonally, and then you go straight up. So down diagonally and then straight up. And you know that this is the second figure. We're going straight up. And then we basically mirror image third and fourth. This is straight in the first column and then diagonal up in the fourth. So I don't know, however you take, I've had students tell me all kinds of things to help them to remember, but these are the four figures. So let's just look at a couple of arguments, and I'll make this make a little more sense. So look at this argument right here. All politicians are crooks. All crooks are out to get you. So all politicians are out to get you. Now, looking at this argument, I want you to look at this and just ask yourself, is it in standard form? And notice right here, out to get you is the predicate term of this. Now, truthfully, I should have done a better job with this because out to get you doesn't name a class. I should have said people who are out to get you, but I wanted to simplify this one, so hopefully you'll forgive that little peccadillo, but it should say people who are out to give you in order to name a class of things in the predicate term. But the lesson I wanted to focus on right here is this is not in, the argument is not in standard form because premise 2 should actually occur first, right? Because this right here is the predicate and the conclusion, and according to convention, the premise that has the major term in it is going to be listed first. So we would flip those around, flip 1 and 2 around. And now the argument is in standard form. All right, well, now that the argument's in standard form, we have to determine its mood. And we look at the quantifiers here, all, and all. So the mood is going to be AAA. All right. Then after we do that, sorry, my voice is cracking. Sorry, you had to hear me drinking water, but then after we do that, we have to determine the figure. And the figure is determined by the position of the middle term. So let's look and see where the middle term is. Well, notice the middle term, crooks, appears right here. Crooks appears here. Now, you probably don't remember the four figures, so I have the chart here. And look back. Do you see where crooks is subject term, predicate term? Do you see that on here? Subject term, predicate term. So the figure is figure 1. And if we were writing this out, if you were to say, what's the mood and figure of this? You just write AAA-1. AAA-1. And so even if you didn't know what was actually the content of the argument, you would know the basic structure of it. And truthfully, you would be able to determine if the argument is valid or invalid. We could determine whether or not this argument is valid or invalid. We could remove all the content. We could remove crooks. We could remove politicians. And we could just say all M are P, all S are M, therefore all S or P. And then and you notice here I'm using M to represent the middle term, P to represent the predicate term of the conclusion, S to represent the subject term of the minor, or the subject term right here actually is of the minor term, and it's also the subject term of the conclusion. And based on that alone, we could go ahead and proceed to determine whether or not the argument is valid or invalid. And so these devices, this way of stating the structure of the argument is actually really important, because when we determine validity, validity is not based on the actual content of what you're saying. It's based on the structure of how you say it. I mean, you could have concepts that, if you arrange them differently, would actually be valid, but you have to structure your thoughts properly in order to successfully demonstrate a conclusion, validly demonstrate a conclusion. Well, let's look at another example. I'm going to give you a few more because I think it'll help you. So, all warm-blooded animals are mammals. Some aquatic animals are not mammals. Some aquatic animals are not warm-blooded animals. I should say warm-blooded animals. Sorry, I left the word off at the end, but it doesn't matter. So the first thing we want to do is figure out what's the mood of this. And so let's look at our quantifiers here. Notice we have all, some are not, some are not. Now hopefully you remember the abbreviations for the form of each categorical proposition. And if you do, you'll know this is A, O, O. And that's just, just number one is, this is an A form proposition, this is an O form proposition, and 3 is an O form proposition. Now what we want to do is figure out the figure. And notice here we have mammals listed right there, and the predicate term of the major premise and the predicate term of the minor premise. Now I'm sure you don't remember, but we look over here and we'll notice, where do we see it anywhere on here where it's in the predicate term of both? Oh yeah, right here. It's right here. So it's figure 2. So we'd say this is figure 2, and if you were just say, what's the mood and figure of this argument? The way you'd write it out is A-O-O-2. So there are a lot of typos in this, but that's pretty par for the course. So, all right, well, I want to do 2 more examples, and I want to do one in which you have to reconstruct the argument. So the 2 I just gave you, I stated the argument in premise conclusion form. But what if you come across, God forbid, an argument that isn't in premise conclusion form, that everything's out of order? Well, let's look at that. So read along with me. Some advocates of socialism understand how the markets work. After all, every economist understands how the markets work, and some economists are advocates of socialism. So the first thing we have to do if we're going to determine the mood and figure of this argument is we have to put it into standard form. And the best way to do that is to figure out, well, what's the conclusion of this argument? So take a second and think about this. What's the conclusion of this argument? Well, hopefully you figured out that the very first sentence is the conclusion of the argument. And we do have an indicator word here, after all. If I say, blah, 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 after all, well, you can presume that the first thing I said, I'm going to try to support it after the after all phrase. After all is a premise indicator phrase. So we don't know exactly what our major premise is at this point. We don't know what our minor premise is. But we do know what our conclusion is. Some advocates, I guess I could have said, therefore, some advocates of socialism understand how the markets work. Now, I am going to be a little nitpicky here, but notice that I named a class right here, Advocates of Socialism. I didn't name a class right here, Understand How the Markets Work, and also left out my copula. So just to, fix things and get all technical here, this is what we should say. Some advocates of socialism are, because I have my copula here, people who understand how the markets work. Now notice I have a class here, Advocates of Socialism. I also name a class here, people who understand how the markets work. So I did that because it's going to be helpful for figuring out what our major premise is and what our minor premise is. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out what our major premise is. Now how do we do this? Well, basically we identify our major term, and our major term is people who understand how the markets work. Now let's look up here. We look right here. Some economists are advocates of socialism. No. Every economist understands how the markets work. Oh, well, look. This right here, every economist is a person who understands how the market works. So this first part of this second sentence, this is going to be our major premise. And we can write it down here in the following way. Every economist understands how the market works. Now, this premise also is not in standard form. Notice I have a non-standard quantifier here, all. Notice also I don't have a copula here. Notice also, understands how the market works, doesn't name a class. So to put this into standard form, we're going to have to rewrite it as the following way. All economists are people who understand how the markets work. My tense is off here. I thought I'd gotten all my typos out of the way, but apparently not. But all economists are people who understand how the markets work. Okay. Now, we've got our major premise stated. We know this is the major premise because this contains the major term in it. The major term, again, is the predicate term in the conclusion. Now all we have to do is figure out what the minor term is. And this is kind of the easy part. It's going to be whatever is left in this particular argument. So some economists are advocates of socialism. And I'm just going to go ahead and, fill this in correctly. Some economists are people. I'm just going to go ahead and include the are people part so that we're naming a class of things down here. So now we have put this argument into standard form. We have the major premise stated first. The major premise comes first, which we were able to identify based on the fact that it contains the major term. The major term is the whole phrase, people who understand how the markets work. Because remember, this is the predicate term right here, people who understand how the markets work. And then we have the minor term, the minor premise coming second, and then we have the conclusion. Notice also we have each proposition is in standard form. We have the quantifier, the subject term, the copula, and then the predicate, and both the subject and the predicate name a class. Same thing here, same thing in the conclusion. So what's the mood and the figure of this argument? I'm going to write it on a different screen so I have more room to work with. But we want to figure out the mood. Well, we first identify the order of the quantifiers. All, some. And hopefully you remember your abbreviations and you'll know that all is an A form, some is an I form, and so we write A, I. Now we want to figure out what the figure is. Well, we have to locate the middle term. Well, look right here. Lo and behold, there's the middle term. Now, I doubt seriously you remember the four figures, so we're going to look on the chart. And we're looking for a figure in which the subject term is the middle term of the major premise, and the subject term of the minor premise is also the middle term. That's a lot. Basically, in which the middle term occurs first in both the minor and major premise. And do we see that anywhere? Is it here? No, it's not there. It's not there. It's not here. Oh, look, it's right here. And so this would be figure 3. And we could just write this out, AII3. That's what this argument is. And again, this is going to be important because we can actually determine whether or not all AII3 arguments are valid. Now notice, look, if like I said, the content when we're determining validity doesn't really matter. The truth is, if an argument form is valid, it's always valid, no matter what the content of it is. If we didn't have economist, the word economist here, I had gopher, and I had the word gopher here, and I had mammal here, and I mean, just saying we could substitute anything we want. That might not have made a lot of sense to you at this point, but we could substitute anything we want and put it in an AII3 argument. It would always be valid, no matter what. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this argument is a valid form. But we could substitute anything we want in place of it, and it would always be valid. So finally, I want to do one more example. And in this example, I want to kind of work in an opposite direction. Suppose that you were given a form of an argument first, and you had to, you were given the mood and figure of the argument first, and you had to figure out how the argument was structured. So I said, hey, we're dealing with an EIO1 argument. How would you go about reconstructing this? Well, to me, the easiest thing to do is to begin by just writing the quantifiers out. And you know your quantifier for your first one is an E-form proposition. So it's going to be no blank is blank, because we don't know what we're dealing with. I don't know, for instance, if this right here is the middle term and this is going to be the predicate, or if or in the major term, or if this is where the major term is going to be and this is where the middle term is going to be. I know that the middle term is going to be in one of these, and I know that the major term is going to be in one of these. I just don't know which one. But I do know that no comes first because it's E. Then we have I, and I is a sum R. Again, I don't know the location of the middle term, and I don't know the location of the minor term. And then finally, we write sum S R naught. And the reason we said sum S R naught P, and the reason we were able to fill this in is we know this is an O, and we know an O form is sum R naught. But we also know that the conclusion is always going to have the subject term first and the predicate term right here. The minor term always comes first in the conclusion, and the major term always comes last. So it doesn't matter what it is. It'll always be S first and then P second. All right. Well, then we're going to have to figure out, where the middle term is located and the argument. And we do that by looking at 1. And again, you probably don't remember, but notice here the middle term occurs first here in first figure. It occurs in the subject term here, and then it occurs in the predicate term here. So we go back, and then the middle term, we're just going to put an M right here to represent the middle term. And notice I'm basically just getting it off this chart. I know the middle term occurs just like that, so just fill it in. And then it's pretty much easy after that, because we know that the major term occurs in the first premise, so we just put a P there because we have the predicate term right here. We just put the P right there, and then we put the S in right here. And so this is how we would reconstruct an argument if we're just given the mood and figure. Like I said, start by writing out the quantifiers and writing out the quantifiers and kind of putting, like I said, I just do blanks. You could do it mentally if you want. For the spaces where the middle term would go, the major term and the minor term would go. And then the conclusion, you can just write it out fully, because you know the subject term always occurs first in the conclusion and the predicate always occurs secondly. And then once you figure that out, then you figure out the figure, and the figure you figure out just by looking at ye old chart right here. It's not that complicated. And you figure out the middle term, and then once you figure that out, you just stick the P and I don't know, whatever the other one is in the first premise, and the S and whatever the other one is in the second premise, and wherever the middle term isn't. So hopefully, I know this is kind of taxing and a little bit boring, but it will have payoff. We have to know the parts of the syllogism in order to determine whether or not they're valid or invalid. So here's your homework for next class. The first part right here, you're going to be doing some of the reconstructing the argument when you've been given the mood and the figure. The second part down here, you're going to be given some arguments, and some of them aren't going to be in standard form. You're going to have to put the argument into standard form. And then once you've done that, you're going to have to identify the mood and the figure.